start, you think? Yeah. All right. So thanks, everybody. I'm Frank Reese from Cappella Books in Atlanta. Thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know, during normal times, our most frequent partner for author events is the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And one of the outstanding programs of recent years we did together there was with the acclaimed journalist Chris Whipple, discussing the book, The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chief of Staffs Define Every Presidency. Appropriately enough, sharing the stage that night was Jimmy Carter's own Chief of Staff, Jack Watson. Well, political fans, you're in luck. We've put the band back together tonight to discuss Whipple's new book, The Spymasters, How the CIA Directors Shape History and the Future. Normally, your host for the evening would be the Carter Library Public Affairs Director, Tony Clark. Unfortunately, Tony couldn't be with us tonight, and I am so honored that he asked me to step in. So while our two guests are talking, you can participate by sharing with us your own questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll come back at the end of the program to ask those questions for you. If you haven't already purchased your copy of the Spymasters, you may do so on our website, acapella.com. And if after watching you think of someone else who you think would enjoy watching tonight's talk, we are recording it and it will be available on Acapella's Facebook page. Thanks again for joining us tonight. I am now going to join you as we listen to what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation with former Presidential Chief of Staff Jack Watson and the best-selling author of The Spymasters, Chris Whipple.
Thank you, Frank. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Chris. Chris, can you hear me all right?
I can.
Okay. I'd like to say a word about Chris before I ask Chris a question. He is, as many of you already know, an acclaimed journalist, a documentarian, a writer of splendid books. The New York Times bestseller of The Gatekeepers was a huge success and has been adopted on curricula of various colleges across the country. And the same has just been done for the Spymasters for a special class at Yale University. He has won Emmys. He has won Peabody Awards. He combines the crisp writing style of a journalist with the deep and careful research of an historian. And he is a marvelous interviewer, as I can attest myself. So, Chris, with that brief introduction, let me ask you the first question. What would you say are the major factors that determine whether or not a director of Central Intelligence will be a successful director?
Well, Jack, let me just begin by saying that of all the events I've had on this book tour, this is one I've really been looking forward to, getting the band back together. Just a quick spoiler alert, because I want to say a word about you. The spoiler alert is that some of the attributes that make outstanding White House chiefs of staff also serve CIA directors well. And we can get into that in a second. But I just want to say that Jack Watson would have made a great CIA director had he chosen that path, because the qualities are similar. So that brings me to what makes a great CIA director, and there's no graduate school for it, just as there isn't for White House chiefs. There's no rule that says that insiders are more effective than outsiders. There have been successes and failures from both directions. I think, as I alluded to a second ago, that there are some qualities. It's no coincidence that Leon Panetta, for example, was the gold standard at both, not only as a White House chief of staff, but as a CIA director. And one of the reasons for that is that Leon, when he came to the CIA at the age of 70, had been around the block, as he put it to me. He knew Capitol Hill, he knew the White House, but most important, he was grounded, he was comfortable in his own skin, and he could walk into the Oval Office and tell Barack Obama what he didn't want to hear, which, as anybody who's read the Gatekeepers knows is rule number one for being White House Chief of Staff. So I think that temperament and confidence and independence go a long way toward making successful CIA directors. And you don't have to be an expert in intelligence. Panetta didn't know much about it when he came in as an outsider, but he listened and he delegated and he told the president hard truths.
Chris, what are you looking for in the relationship between the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, and the president that he or she serves? What in that relationship is most important? What are some of the most important factors in that relationship?
Yeah. Well, let me try to answer it this way. It is an almost impossible balancing act because the CIA director has to be able to tell the president hard truths while also having his ear. That's difficult in the best of times, and it may be mission impossible in these times with this president, and we can come back to that. Richard Helms had a fascinating relationship with LBJ that I describe in the book. He was, on the one hand, a great admirer of LBJ's domestic policies, his great society, and he was completely exasperated by LBJ's inability to see clearly when it came to the Vietnam War. And one of the stories I tell, as you know, is that LBJ, on his own authority, commissioned a study of the underlying premise of the Vietnam War, the so-called domino theory, which posited that if we permitted South Vietnam to fall to the communists, that all of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. Well, as it turned out, Helms's study said it was flawed. There just wasn't much to it. Well, LBJ didn't want to hear that. He, quote unquote, deep sixed that report. Nobody else saw it. Including Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who years later called up poor Cynthia Helms's widow, answered the phone, and McNamara chewed her out, asking her why he hadn't seen this earlier. Anyway, marvelous untold story that she gave me. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that that relationship is everything. The CIA director commands an army of analysts, covert operatives, lethal drones, all kinds of things. But if he or she does not have the ear of the president, the whole relationship is for naught. And it's critical that that relationship be not too friendly, but there has to be some confidence and trust. But going both ways.
CIA director also has the Special Activities Division, which is the covert operative division of the CIA, which is used probably more frequently than people realize. Chris, I would ask your opinion on this, because we had this problem to some extent in our administration. I think that it's very important for the director of the CIA to also have a very good working relationship, albeit the most important one being with the president, obviously, with the National Security Advisor, with the Secretary of Defense, with the Secretary of State, and now, under the new organization, with the Director of National Intelligence. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And that relationship is very important. Someone once said that the National Security Advisor has access but no troops. And the CIA director has troops, but no access. Unless he or she can gain that trust. And Stansfield Turner and Jimmy Carter were a fascinating example of a relationship that, as you know better than anybody, Jack, on paper, Stansfield Turner seemed like the perfect choice as CIA director. He was a 4-star admiral, outranked Jimmy Carter at Annapolis.
Rhodes Scholar.
Rhodes Scholar, brilliant. He seemed to have everything on paper. But for whatever reason, that relationship didn't click. Once Turner was at the CIA, he'd come over to the Oval Office, and by all accounts, Carter just didn't have much patience for him. And Turner was kind of a Boy Scout. He was very earnest, and he was almost kind of pious about things. And he was just completely outmaneuvered by crafty characters like Zbigniew Brzezinski.
That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, and so that relationship didn't click. And one of the great stories, of course, was Stansfield Turner early on realized there was a so-called intelligence briefing going on early in the morning in the Oval Office.
6:30 every morning.
Turner complained about this to Brzezinski, and Brzezinski said, "Stan, you're absolutely right." And the next day, they changed the title of that briefing to National Security Briefing. And
True story.
Turner was still not invited.
Yes. You know, I can comment briefly. There was not a personal comfort in the relationship between Stansfield Turner, and the president. They had known each other for a very long time. And as you say, Stan had credentials that were beyond almost imagining that would seem to fit him perfectly for the job. But in my opinion, he brought a kind of military formality to the job that didn't quite fit in the way that the president liked to be briefed and was most comfortable being briefed, number one. And number two, Stan didn't speak up. You have to, a CIA director or a national security advisor, or for that matter, a White House chief of staff, has to speak up sometimes. And Stan didn't do that.
Yeah. Now fast forward to the Bill Clinton era and James Woolsey, who was Clinton's first CIA director. After the first briefing, it apparently went on and on and on, and Woolsey was briefing him on Iran, I believe. When Woolsey left, Clinton turned to one of his aides and said, "I never want to see that man again." And he almost never did. Yeah. Another case of a relationship that just didn't work. So it's important.
Well, and it's interesting to me that in the final analysis, the nature and quality of the personal relationship matters. Aside from credentials, aside from how well prepared the director is, aside from all the other criteria that you would check off,
and
the nature of the personal relationship has to be comfortable.
It absolutely does, and that brings us, Jack, I think, to the flip side of that, which is very dangerous, and that is, given the importance of that relationship, the temptation for a CIA director to politicize intelligence and tell the president what he wants to hear. That way lies disaster, but it's built into this relationship. That risk is built in, because if you are George Tenet, for example, and if you believe that that you have to have a seat at the table and you have to have the confidence of the president, you can be tempted to tell him that your assessment about weapons of mass destruction is more solid than it actually is. I personally, we could talk about 9/11 all night, and we don't need to, but I personally feel that my portrait of George Tenet was not as damning as some others. I don't believe that he cooked the books, as it were, and simply fixed the intelligence to please Dick Cheney and others the way some have suggested. That seems to be the conventional wisdom. I think Tenet produced a very flawed assessment of WMDs, but I think he believed in it, and he shouldn't have had such confidence in it.
Where George Tenet did not fail, as you point out in the book, Chris, was in alerting the White House, the president, the national security advisor, to the imminent possibility of a major attack on the United States. I believe, if I remember correctly, that first meeting took place in July, and he went over, talked to Condoleezza Rice, who was at the time the national security advisor. They laid out in rather stark fashion the imminence of something like that happening. They didn't know where it was going to happen, but they knew it was going to be major. They knew it was going to involve the possibility of a great loss of life. And the Bush White House simply didn't pick up the ball.
I spell it out in exacting detail, as you know, in my chapter, and I was lucky because I had not only George Tenet, who rarely gives interviews, I had his account of this crisis meeting on July 10, 2001, a couple of months before 9/11. But I also had Cofer Black, who was the head of the Counterterrorism Center, and Rich Blee, who was head of the Al-Qaeda unit, who hasn't been on the record before, but is in my book. And they went over and in no uncertain terms, as you say, Cofer Black pounded on the table with Condi Rice and said, we have to go on a war footing now.
In effect, what they were asking for, I think, Chris, and you point this out in the book, was help. They wanted the White House to engage other agencies of the government, state, defense, FBI, Homeland Security. They wanted an all-out, full-on analysis of the possibilities, and that help was not forthcoming because the White House didn't make it happen. Correct?
That's exactly right. They didn't want to hear about it. The George W. Bush's White House was focused on other things, Iraq most of all at the time. And as Cofer put it, they were in a kind of a time warp. These were people who had served previously, and as Cofer Black put it, their idea of terrorists was a bunch of guys stay up and drink champagne by night and blow stuff up during the day. They couldn't imagine a bunch of people in caves in Afghanistan bringing this kind of havoc. But all Condi Rice had to do, to me, this is the tantalizing what might have been. Had she called a principals meeting, the so-called with heads of departments around the table. As you know, Jack, when you have that kind of process and you shake the trees, things fall out. And in all likelihood, I think what might have fallen out was the presence of 2 Al-Qaeda terrorists on US soil for the prior 2 to 3 months. That was known. People knew this in the government, but there was no meeting at which somebody said, okay, go get them, pick them up.
Yeah, and it's the White House that would have to call that principals meeting. It's the National Security Advisor who would be the convener of that.
Right.
And let me switch gears. We know and understand that the main client of the CIA director is the President of the United States. We know that access to and trust and confidence with the President of the United States is the sine qua non of the job. But there are other aspects of it. Talk to us a little bit about congressional oversight of intelligence and the responsibility of the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, to relate to the Congress of the United States.
Yeah, it's true. You know, the world of intelligence changed dramatically in the 1970s and in the late 1970s after all of the scandals of the so-called family jewels, which was that compendium, 693 pages of skullduggery and misdeeds and violations of the law and the CIA's charter that all came spilling out in the mid-70s under a fascinating CIA director named Bill Colby. I think he's a fascinating character. To me, he was kind of the Michael Corleone of the CIA. He was a reluctant director who carried a copy of the Constitution around in his pocket, who believed in transparency and who decided to tell Congress the secrets. Well,
it was the Church Committee, of course, Frank Church's committee, that was spearheading that whole line of investigation. And it was that committee that Bill Colby cooperated with.
That's right. And he set off a virtual civil war within the CIA and between the old guard, represented by Richard Helms, the quintessential CIA director, and James Jesus Angleton, the infamous counterintelligence head, and the new guard, represented by Colby. In any event, ever since we've had congressional oversight, which has been absolutely essential and critical, and it means, among other things, that every significant covert operation has to be briefed to the so-called Gang of Eight in Congress. I think that's made all the difference, and it's absolutely critical and essential, and it's why we haven't had all of the scandals since then. There have been some scandals, WMDs included, but congressional oversight's made all the difference. And I believe, as you know, Jack, strongly, and this is where I think the current intelligence leadership has fallen down. I believe that the CIA director has to be, at the end of the day, not only the honest broker of intelligence to the president, but to Congress and the American people. And I think that, number one, John Ratcliffe, who is the current director of national intelligence, who nominally outranks the CIA director, has been just a disgraceful partisan zealot on behalf of Donald Trump. And Gina Haspel, alas, as CIA director, I think has been AWOL on too many occasions where she should have testified in public about things Donald Trump didn't want to hear.
Chris, talk to us a little bit about the annual worldwide threat assessment briefing, both in person and in writing, from the DCI to the Congress, and the relevance of that with respect to the coronavirus warning.
This is a critical example of what I was just talking about. For years and years and years, as long as anyone can remember, it's been an annual tradition that the CIA, the heads of the intelligence community, including the CIA director, go to Congress and they brief the so-called worldwide threat assessment, their best analysis of the top threats. This is important for a number of reasons. Congress has to be informed. The public has to have an idea of what the major threats are. Testifying in public makes it much more difficult to politicize intelligence in private. That's the point. And when Dan Coates went and testified in 2019 that Iran was in compliance with the nuclear accords, global warming was real, ISIS hadn't been defeated yet. When he said all these things that were demonstrably true, but anathema to Donald, and Donald Trump berated him, and ultimately he had to resign, but that was his job, and he did it.
That was his
and he did it.
Another very important part of that worldwide threat assessment on January the 19th of January of 2019 was again a plain-spoken, stark warning about the imminence of a global pandemic, which also warned that we weren't ready for it, despite the fact that in an international assessment of the countries of the world that would be best positioned to deal with a pandemic, it was done by the World Health Organization. They concluded that the United States and Great Britain were in the best position of all countries in the world to deal with a pandemic. And of course, that turned out not to be true. But following the 2019 warning about the pandemic and warning that we needed to do better to prepare for such a thing, what happened then in January of 2020?
Well, there was no briefing. There was no briefing of the worldwide threat assessment. Now you can think that's a coincidence, or you can be a sentient human being and realize that it was not a coincidence. And can you imagine, as you said, Jack, in 2019, when a year before anyone had heard of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, there was a stark warning of a generalized but stark warning about a possible pandemic. Can you imagine what would have been in the 2020 version of the WWTA? It would have been stark, and it would have been something Trump wanted to cover up. And sure enough, the WWTA never happened. Bob Gates, who's been around for a long time, said that he'd never heard of this happening in his experience.
Let's switch over to another document, Chris. The President's Daily Brief, the PDB. Please Please tell us what that is, why it's significant, and then also relate the PDB in January of 2020 to the coronavirus.
So this is why, in my opinion, one of the reasons why, whereas the 9/11 attacks were preceded famously by red lights flashing, I believe the coronavirus pandemic was, by comparison, horns blaring, sirens sounding in a parade down Main Street. There were such clear-cut warnings for so long that the president ignored. Chief among those warnings, the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, which is the most important document the intelligence community produces on a daily basis, and hundreds of thousands of man hours and woman hours go into producing this document, which is now currently presented by the Director of National Intelligence and the briefer to the President. Well, throughout January and February, we know that there were warnings about the coronavirus. We also know that there'd been an almost complete breakdown in the briefing process. And I have a whole chapter in the Spymasters about the coronavirus, what the president knew and when he knew it, and what the intelligence community told him. It's not pretty. He was told repeatedly. It was in the President's Daily Brief. The president doesn't read the President's Daily Brief, this president. Famously, on January 23rd, Trump later said to Fox that he was briefed on the coronavirus. It was the first he'd ever heard of it. He was briefed by a woman named Beth Sanner. Her name was revealed. And she told him it was, quote, no big deal, end quote. Well, the PDB, by definition, everything in it is a big deal. Moreover, when it is briefed verbally, in addition to being in writing in the PDB, it's a very big deal. And my sources tell me that Beth Sanner said no such thing. And yet this has been repeated disappointingly by some news organizations taking Trump at face value. I don't believe it for a second. And of course, he was warned in many other ways by many other sources.
Let me just interject an historical note. All the presidents that I know, including Carter, Obama, Clinton, George W., took the PDB very seriously, President's Daily Brief very seriously. They met every day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, always 5, unless they were out of town. In the case of Carter, he read it thoroughly, he notated it, he had questions for the oral briefing that he would get each morning from the briefer, at that time a CIA briefer. Yeah. And by contrast, President Trump has dropped the daily brief to once a week. He dropped from once a day, once every day, to a couple of times a week, and then to once a week. And from what I hear from my friends and sources, and from reading well-researched books like yours, Chris, he's a very difficult man to brief. He doesn't read the brief and has a tendency to go off on other subjects. It's a very difficult situation.
Now, in fairness to Trump, he's not the first president, and I write about this, as you know,
yes,
not the first president to come into office convinced that the CIA was a deep state hell-bent on bringing him down.
Nixon.
That's exactly what Richard Nixon thought of the CIA. And he thought Dick Helms was a martini-sipping elitist who was determined to destroy him. Well, Nixon was wrong. Donald Trump is wrong. The vast majority, 99% of the people out at Langley and in the intelligence community are pretty good at keeping their heads down and ignoring whoever is in the Oval Office and just trying to produce honest intelligence, honest analysis, and to carry out their spying and covert operations to the best of their ability. So both presidents were deluded, but Nixon's delusions pale in comparison to Donald Trump's.
Well, you say in your book, I made a note of it. You said, as we've seen in earlier chapters of your book, this country has previously been led by presidents who were delusional, but no other president has dealt with a major national crisis by denying that it existed, which is the case with Mr. Trump.
This is the fundamental problem, and it's another reason why November 3 is such a critical day. The fact of the matter is, this is a president. Nixon had his delusions about there was something. He tried to blackmail Dick Helms, and he thought there must have been secrets in the Bay of Pigs that would benefit him. He was deluded about that. But Donald Trump takes it to another level, and what is so almost unbelievable, even after 4 years, in my mind, is how not only is his current White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, but his current Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, have conspired in this wholesale denial of basic science, high school science. I mean, this is what is so unbelievable to me. And again, he brings such contempt for the intelligence community into office that he frankly believes almost nothing they tell him. And that's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. Chris, comment on what you have taken away from all your interviews and all your research and all your reading of the history of the last 70 years in terms of U.S. intelligence. Tell us what you think about the value of human intelligence, covert, spy intelligence, versus what's called SIGINT, signal intelligence.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
This is there's always been a tension, Jack, between those who believe in the importance of human intelligence versus those who really think that signals intelligence and other kinds of intelligence are more valuable.
Let me define for our audience that signal intelligence really means electronic surveillance of a wide variety of sources. Yeah. And in our day and time and in recent history, the capability of the National Security Agency, the NSA, to conduct worldwide electronic surveillance and intercept is beyond all imagining. That's what signal intelligence is. Go ahead.
And I can't pretend to be an expert on signals intelligence. No way, no how. But having said that, this was one of the problems that Stan Turner got into when he went to the CIA. Yeah. He had his problems with the White House. His problems internally at CIA were that there was a perception. Not only did he bring his own coterie of deputies in with him, which is a mistake. Pardon the phone. But just grab it. But sorry about that. But there was a perception at CIA that Stan Turner cared more about signals intelligence than he cared about human intelligence, that he preferred toys to spies. And so he never quite recovered from that. At the end of the day, I think, now fast forward to the current era, and God knows technology has increased exponentially. It's become more and more important in the world of spying. But I think that at the end of the day, human intelligence is still absolutely critical. I mean, one of the lessons of 9/11, one of the real failures of 9/11 was the CIA's inability to penetrate Al-Qaeda, to have spies inside. God knows one of the great failures of all time, that was the fall of the Shah of Iran, we were blinded because we didn't have anyone, the CIA didn't have anyone inside the Ayatollah Khomeini's camp. That was true in August. Well, it was fortunately not true, actually, in August of 2016, when the CIA had not only all kinds of signals intelligence, but they had, importantly, they had someone inside the Kremlin. They had a human being who confirmed in August of 2016 that the order to attack the 2016 presidential election was given by Vladimir Putin himself. And that's a great story that I tell in the book as well, about that source and how the CIA had to extract him from Russia because they were afraid that he might be discovered. But he made all the difference in understanding the nature of the Russian assault on our election.
Did you talk with the recent CIA directors, because it would be more relevant in more recent years than earlier, about our capabilities on our own defensive and offensive capabilities with respect both to cyber warfare and social media disinformation?
Yeah, I did. And cyber warfare is, as you can imagine, it's a fraught area where we are vulnerable, and we're much better at offense than we are at defense. And that is one of the reasons why Barack Obama found himself paralyzed when John Brennan came over and briefed him in a very small circle of his advisors, which I tell in the opening chapter of the Spymasters. When Brennan came over and told Obama what was happening and the nature of the threat, the risk of, they could have launched, and Jim Clapper, the then director of national intelligence, was in favor of launching a cyber attack on the Russians, a kind of brushback pitch, if you will, to tell them that you better stop right now. We could have paralyzed the Russian economy, but Obama was afraid that that could have triggered an escalation, and who knows where it would have gone. We are vulnerable, and Leon, the thing that kept Leon Panetta up at night, when I asked him, what was it? What was the one thing? He said it was a cyber attack that could take down the entire United States electrical grid. That kept him up at night. So it's a very dangerous new arena of warfare.
Yes. As frightening as that is, and I, based on the limited reading I've done, like you, I'm no expert on any of these things, but it's a subject of interest to me, cyber warfare and the capabilities of nations now to engage in it. And I think cyber warfare in today's world is more or less the equivalent of nuclear war. It has that much devastating potential.
Yeah.
It can literally close down countries, as would happen if our grid was closed down.
Yeah.
Even more insidious, Chris, is the social media disinformation campaigns and what effects they can have. We're experiencing that right now. We experienced it in ways that we don't even know about. We, the public, don't even know about in 2016. And it's something that bothers me a lot. Do you agree?
There are people, including Mike Morrell, the two-time acting director, who told me that our failure to anticipate the Russian social media assault on our election was a strategic intelligence failure right up there with the fall of the Shah of Iran.
Yes. Well, and as you point out in the book, the Russians in 2003, I think, if my memory serves, with respect to Estonia, shut down their power grid for a limited period of time. Again, about 5 years later, 2008 or so, in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, they did the same thing. So we had warnings about it, and we had warnings about their capability to do it. Chris, having done this superb book, and it really is superb, I think it's a must read, really, for anyone who's interested in the way the US government works, in the way the White House works, uh, in the way intelligence works within our national security apparatus. You've done a marvelous job. And I think your book is going to have a lasting effect and going to be on a lot of bookshelves and a lot of colleges and universities in the years to come. With that preface, let me ask you, is there one or two lessons that you take away from this, 2 years at least, 2 years, more than that, of research that you did to produce this book?
I knew you were softening me up for a really tough question, right? Um, couple of things, I guess, if I had to choose. One would be something I alluded to before, which is the you cannot overstate, and I didn't know this going in, but it seems to me, having studied this now, going back 5 decades, it's hard to overstate the importance of the position. As I said, the CIA director is the person we depend on to prevent another 9/11 or assault on the 2016 election. Couldn't be more important. Maybe more important than the White House Chief of Staff, and you know how strongly I feel about that. The second major overarching point would be the importance of the director as the honest broker of intelligence, not only to the president, which I think is a common conception, but to the Congress and the American people. It couldn't be more important.
Well, thank you, Chris. I hope your book, like the Gatekeepers book of a few years ago, is another New York Times bestseller for you. It deserves to be. And thank you for letting me participate with you this evening at the Carter Center.
Well, CIA has its gang of 8. You were my gang of 1. You were my expert and gave me great notes on every chapter. So thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you to both of you. This has been an amazing almost hour, and I can tell from our viewers and the questions that we've all just been kind of focused on the two of you in this amazingly interesting and in-depth conversation. There are a few questions from the audience to talk about before we wrap up. And I'm going to take advantage of my position to ask the first of them. We recently, as I mentioned earlier to Chris today, also got the opportunity to host John Brennan, CIA director, with his most recent book. And it strikes me that his role now is unique, or certainly unusual, if not unique, in how outspokenly political he has become as a former CIA director. Is that role unprecedented in your observation, Chris? And what do you think about a former CIA director being as vocal as he has been?
I'd say 2 things. First, yes, it is almost unprecedented. And second, so is this president. And that would be my short answer. That there's no question. I was with Bob Gates at his cabin in Washington State, interviewing him coincidentally the day that the letter was sent for his signature opposing Trump's revocation of Brennan's security clearance. And Gates told me, I'm going to sign it. But I really got my issues with Brennan and how outspoken he's been. And that sentiment is shared by a lot of former directors. It's unusual, for sure. CIA directors, retired CIA directors, are supposed to float above the fray. But I would simply say, in defense of Brennan, that these are unusual times that call for unusual comments. And it should tell everyone something. That is not just John Brennan, but General Michael Hayden and James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, who are saying, this is not acceptable. This assault on the intelligence community is beyond the pale by this president. And his politicization of the community would make Richard Nixon blush, in my opinion. Jack, what do you think?
I agree. In all of U.S. history, and certainly modern history, which is what we're focused on here, post-World War II history, there's never been a president who has denigrated and disparaged and criticized the entire intelligence community of the United States in the way or to the extent that this president has. And for him in Helsinki to be on a podium with the president of Russia, Mr. Putin, and to say in response to a journalist's question that since Putin had said to him they didn't have anything to do with interference in the 2016 election, and he believed Mr. Putin and not the entire unanimous recommendation or observation of the intelligence community, that's simply going way too far. I personally, though I understand why Bob Gates said what he did and felt the way he did, I applaud John Brennan and Michael Hayden and James Clapper for speaking out.
Chris, the first audience question is from Charles Milstead, and he comments how much he enjoyed your Chief of Staff's book, and he's wondering if you plan to compile any kind of expose or any other work about these recent 4 years, much of which we've been talking about tonight.
Well, you know what they say in the intelligence community? I could tell you, but yeah, I think you can rest assured that this isn't the last word on the subject. From me, for whatever that may be worth. I did write a column for the Washington Post a month and a half ago or so, arguing that this president is unbriefable, as I put it, and explained why I thought that was dangerous. And I'll continue to report and write and hope that my voice contributes something to the debate.
Another question from listener Timothy Eastling is asking, based on what you do know from his political career of Joe Biden, how do you think he will handle the intelligence he's given if he is our next president?
My guess is that we will return to more normal times. I think that Biden has a healthy respect for the intelligence community, and I think he there have been various names bandied about already as possible CIA directors. I think there's very little chance that the current director, Gina Haspel, will continue, that's for sure. Radcliffe will be gone. It'll be interesting to see because, but I think no question in my mind that Biden, who considers himself a foreign policy expert, he knows just how valuable the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, is, and he knows how valuable the intelligence community is. And I'm sure he'll pick someone he thinks he can work closely with.
Last question from one of our audience who apparently has some personal remembrances of observing things in Virginia from potential Al-Qaeda operatives, according to the person who's asked the question. But what you've learned when researching the intelligence breakdown with 9/11, how long before 9/11 do you think Al-Qaeda operatives were in the U.S. planning that mission?
Well, so far as I know, the only Al-Qaeda operatives who were in the country were the two hijackers, Al-Hamdi and Al-Mizdar. They should have been picked up months before the 9/11 attacks. CIA, some at the CIA knew that they were on U.S. soil. George Tenet claims that he did not. The CIA director, that he was not told. Those CIA officers who knew insist that they told the FBI. there was a breakdown. There was a complete breakdown in communications between CIA and FBI. But other than those two hijackers, no, I'm not aware of any other Al-Qaeda who were on U.S. soil.
Do you think the changes that were made after 9/11 in the intelligence community have helped in terms of
I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was lucky enough in the launch party for my book by Zoom. I had a couple of guests join us, including John Brennan and Jim Clapper. And as I started to describe how I thought in the beginning that the whole DNI restructuring was a muddle and it confused lines of authority, they jumped in and ganged up on me immediately. And Brennan insisted that he could never have run the CIA if Jim Clapper had not taken the other 17 agencies and coordinated them. And Clapper was vehement that the DNI structure was a good solution. I think it was a mess until the right people were in those jobs. And I really do think that Clapper and Brennan were a great team. It worked well with those two. Prior to that, not so much.
Very good. Well, I know one CIA director we haven't talked about tonight much, if at all. Bill Casey is sort of a fascinating character to me. I was talking with someone the other day about how perilous our times seem, and thinking back to that era where Casey and Reagan and the Iran-Contra thing was going on. It's like, those were so much more innocent days, weren't they? It's
Casey is one of my favorite characters in the book, and Mumbles, of course, was they called him because nobody could understand a word he said. He was so unintelligible. And my favorite story maybe was at his funeral when he died, of course, of a brain tumor. But he was so devious that at his funeral, as the closed casket came by, Frank Carlucci, the national security advisor, turned to Ken Duberstein, the chief of staff, and said, "Are you sure he's in there?"
You know, it somehow doesn't seem right that we could have so much fun talking about such serious and grave matters, but this has really been a fantastic evening, and I can't thank the two of you enough for joining us for it.
Thanks for letting us get the band back together.
Yes.
And thanks to all of you out there. Again, the book is The Spymasters by Chris Whipple, and it's available at acapellabooks.com. And this talk is available, will be available shortly at Acapella Books Facebook page. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jack. Great to see both of you.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay.
See you soon.